G'day everyone, my name is Hoi and this video is the beginner's guide to Photoshop. I'm going to show you the tools and techniques to get you started in Photoshop. Now this is for complete beginners, you don't need any prerequisite knowledge, just your enthusiasm. How's that for a tagline? So if you want to follow along using the exact images that I'm using, the links are in the description. Now, before we get started, let's start off with the end in mind. What are we going to learn and what are we going to do? So I've got this image here. This is what we're going to create at the end of this video. It's not the greatest composition in the world, but it does have a mixture of all the tools or the main tools that we should be learning and all the main techniques that we should know to get started in Photoshop. Let's just return to our home screen, which is what you'll see when you open up Photoshop. Now here we can create a new file or we can open up an existing file. Now what we're going to do is open up an existing file here. Let's click on open. And the first thing that we're going to open is the background layer, which is the iPhone here. So we'll click on iPhone and then press open. Now, before we get started, I want to step all the way back and just make sure that you're seeing exactly the interface that I'm seeing. There's nothing more frustrating, I know, to follow a tutorial where they say, click this button, click this option, click this window, when you yourself don't have that option here. So I just want to make sure that we're all using the same user interface, or what we call the workspace here. So let's go to Window and go down to Workspace and just click on Essentials. Now, if you've already got this Essentials selected, but you don't see exactly what I see here, then what you can do is go back to Windows, Workspace, and then just reset Essentials. So if at any time you get a bit lost or you can't find any panels or any of the options that I'm using, just do that. Just go to Window, Workspace, make sure Essentials is selected, and make sure that Reset Essentials is selected. Okay, so before we get started, a little bit more housekeeping. So at the top of your screen is this options bar here. Now this is contextual depending on the tools that you've got selected. At the moment, I've got my move tool selected, which is this 4 arrows here. And this along here is called the toolbar. So depending on the tool that I select, if you just look at this, these give me the options that go along with the tool that I've selected. So this is the object selection, and these are my options depending on what I've selected here, crop tool, etc. Now over on the right here, these are our panels. So if at any times you don't see these panels here, these individual specific panels, you can always go up to Window and then just make sure that the panel that you're looking for is selected. So for example, if you don't see Properties panel here, just go to Windows and just make sure that Properties is selected here. Okay, so this workspace here is called the document window here, or the document view. The first step that we're going to do is import another picture. So if I go back to the sample image here, the hero image or the main image is this baby with the dog. Look at the baby. Oh, who doesn't like the baby? So we're going to import this picture here, and I'm just going to go back up to this iPhone tab here, go up to File, and then go down to Place Embedded, navigate to where your images are saved, and click on the one that says Child, and then press Place. Now, here you have to accept or reject this placement. So this is why this bounding box is coming up with these options here. So if I hover over this, it's saying, do I want to reject this or accept this? So I'm happy with this, so I'm just going to press this tick icon here, or I can press return or enter on my keyboard. Now I say return or enter because I'm on a Mac, it's return, and enter is for PCs. So just click on that. Now the next thing to do is I want to move this picture somewhere in the middle of this phone here. Right, so I need to make sure that my move tool is selected. So remember, this is our toolbar here, and the move tool is the first one here. Because this is the most commonly used tool, I'm going to teach you the keyboard shortcut, which is V for Victor. So press V for Victor or click on this, and then your cursor should change into this cursor here, and then make sure you click and drag this to somewhere that is in the middle of this screen here. Now I'm going to pause here. You might have some trouble. I'm going to address some of these issues here. Now, depending on whether you have auto select on, that means that you're automatically selecting the layer. So if you don't have that on and you can't move it for whatever reason, make sure on your layers panel that you've got your child layer selected. And that means that wherever your cursor happens to be, you don't need to be on this picture here. You can move this child layer here. You see that? But if I have auto select on, I can't move this background layer here because my mouse, my cursor is clicking on this layer here, this iPhone layer here. But this iPhone layer is actually locked, this background layer. If you look on the side of this, here is a padlock. So if I click on this, then I should be able to move this iPhone layer. So let's try that. So my mouse is hovering over the iPhone layer, click and drag. Now I can move it. If I do the same, I hover over this child layer here, click and drag. So with auto select, I can hover over different layers and move that layer, provided that it's not locked. But if I don't have it on, auto select, then no matter whether I hover over the child layer, I'm going actually to move the background layer, the iPhone layer, because my iPhone layer here is selected. Some people like the auto select to be on, and some people like it to be off. Now, I've just developed a habit to turn that off and making sure that I select the right layers on the layers panel here. Now, while we're at the layers, one important thing or one important habit to get into the rhythm of is to name your layers, because when you have a lot of layers, you will get lost. Well, you may get lost depending on how many layers you have. So instead of generic layer 0, you might have layer 1, 2, all the way up to 100. So let's rename that so we can keep track of what we're doing. So let's double click on that, and I'm going to type in iPhone and then press return on my keyboard. I'm going to go back up here and then going to just move that to the center around about here. Now, before we keep going, you might be wondering what on earth are layers. So I'm going to pause here and I'm going to give you a quick explanation about what layers are. Now, I do have a file prepared. I'm just going to open this up, zoom it in a little bit. So what are layers? If you can think of it as transparent sheets of plastic. So if you're looking down on the stack of layers, the top layer will have precedence, which means that whatever's on top will block the bottom layers. Now, what you'll see then is this picture. So just think of layers as stacks of transparent plastic that you can see through unless there is something blocking it. One of the difficulties is that I said I wanted this to be around about the center of the phone, but it's just a guesswork, right? Because I can't really see behind this. One of the things that I can do is to reduce the opacity of this layer, so then I can see both layers at the same time. So I just gave it away. I got ahead of myself just then. So there is an opacity slider here. So what we can do, just make sure that our child layer is selected. So whatever effect that you want to apply on the layer, you have to make sure that that layer is selected. So we want to reduce the opacity here. So at the moment is 100%. So click, drag to the left. There's no magic number here. It's just, can I see both layers at the same time? And I can. So I can see a little bit of the child picture here, and then I can see the edge of the screen here. So around about 50% is good. Now, another way to adjust your opacity is also to hover your mouse over the word opacity, and you can see the cursor changing to this icon here. Now, if I click and then drag to the left, it will reduce the opacity. Now if I go down to 0, you can't see the image here. And then if I do the same but to the right, click and drag all the way up to 100. Now it's at 90%. Now it's at 100% opacity. I can also type into this field 50 and then press return on my keyboard. So make sure that your move tool is selected. Remember, it's over here. Or if you can remember, who can remember the keyboard shortcut for the move tool? If you said V for Victor, you're correct. So thanks for playing at home. So let me just nudge this across ever so slightly, and that I'm happy with. So now I can bump the opacity all the way back up to 100 again, and that's what we want. Now the next thing is that if I want this image to seem like it's jumping out of the screen, I need to fill all this area here that is not being filled with this portrait picture at the moment. Now I deliberately chosen this portrait picture because it doesn't fill this in. It would have been so easy for me just to look for a perfect landscape picture that filled the screen, but that's not a real world scenario. This brings me to the next feature that Adobe has put out, which is called Generative AI, and it's one of the most fantastic features. You'll see why. So to use Generative AI, we need to make a selection. Now to do that, we're going to go to our lasso tool here. By default, you're going to have this, what we call freeform lasso tool here, but it's not the freeform that we want. We want the polygonal lasso tool. So how do we get the polygonal lasso tool? Now you can see that there's a little triangle here. It almost disappears if you don't look for it. So to get more options, hover on the tool here, click and hold on your mouse until these options fly out, and then just select polygonal lasso tool. Now we want to make a selection where we want Adobe Generative AI to magic up some more picture. What I'm going to do is click somewhere a little bit inside this picture here, which also covers this area here. So I'm going to click here once, click here once, click here once. So I'm doing it deliberately sort of outside this area and then going back here. Now, I want to join my selection back to the original point. I know that I'm going to join it because of this circle here next to the icon. If you don't move it close enough to your original starting point, you won't see that circle. You see that I'm moving away and that circle next to the icon doesn't show. So make sure that you're close enough to the original point so the circle comes out, and then that's when you know that you can close your selection. So let's click once here. You'll see what we call marching ants, these black and white moving ants, quote unquote. So whatever we do will be confined to this area here. So before we can use generative fill, we only want generative AI to consider this child image to magic up this extra image here. We don't want it to consider the iPhone image here. So what we need to do in this case is to turn off this layer here. Now clicking on this eyeball will turn off the visibility of this layer, and now you see the checkerboard pattern here. Now this checkerboard pattern in all of Adobe's product suite, including Photoshop, signifies that there's transparency there. So if you go to print this out, it's not going to print the checkerboard pattern, but rather it will just print nothing. It's transparent. Isn't that cool? So now that we've got that there, you can see that there's a taskbar here. It's called a contextual taskbar. Now if you don't see that, let's go to Window and just make sure that contextual taskbar is selected. So I'm just going to click out of that, and now we're ready to do generative fill. If you don't understand what generative fill, now is where the magic happens. So let's click once on this dialog box here. If you're using it for the first time, it's going to ask us to agree to the user guidelines, which please read, and if you agree, press agree. If you don't, press cancel when you can't follow along with the rest of the tutorial. So I'm going to press agree here, and then I'm going to press generate. I'm going to leave this all blank because I just want it to magically magic up some of the background here. So what is happening now is that Adobe is firing off into the cloud, asking its AI, artificial intelligence, to extend this image into this selection here. So what that means is that you need an internet connection to use this feature. So how fast it will generate the bit of image here would depend partly on how big your selection is, as well as how fast your internet connection is. So after it's generated, you will see that one of 3 is selected here or shown here. So we can cycle through the different variations. Now, every time you press generate, it will give you 3 more variations. The other area that you can see the variations is in your properties panel here. So I'm just going to scroll down here, and you can see exactly the same variations. This one just gives you a thumbnail. Now, if for whatever reason that you're not happy with these variations, you can always click on generate here, or in the properties panel here, you can always click generate. So let's do that, and we'll see what other options or variations it will give us. I'm just going to speed this up now. And now you can see that it's one of 6. Now we've got 3 from the previous generation and then the 3 new ones. So I can cycle through that again. And for me, it really doesn't matter which I pick. It's only grass here anyway. So now that we've done this side, we have to generate it for this side, if you remember. So let's turn back our visibility of the iPhone layer here by clicking on this empty space here. And so now we've got this little space here. We also need to do it for this little space here. So remember, I've got my polygonal lasso tool here, and I'm going to click slightly inside this child picture here. And the reason why I do that is so that it can have a reference, a little bit of a reference what it's trying to create, right? So let's click here, and then sort of a little bit outside of it. And then remember to look out for the little circles so we can close our selection. Before we click on Generative Fill, I almost clicked on it, getting ahead of myself. Remember, it's going to consider the whole image here, including the background, which I don't want. So I'm going to click off the visibility icon on the iPhone layer here, and then it will only consider what's on this picture here. So let's click on Generative Fill and then press generate. Now we can always cycle through that again. Now again, it really doesn't matter because it's only a really small space here. So I will choose this one here. Now there are limitations to Generative Fill. There's also a monthly limits to how many you can use. Now this is beyond the scope of this tutorial. I'm going to paste a link in the description so you can check out those limits. So for the time being, let's return to what we're doing here. I'm going to turn the visibility back on my iPhone here. Now, before we get on to the next issue, now this contextual taskbar hang around in awkward positions, right? And the reason why it's awkward is that it normally shows up underneath what you were working on before. So what I can do is I can move it out the way here, and then I'm going to click on these 3 dots and say, look, just leave it up there. I'm going to pin the bar position. Once you pin it, you can always reset it. So reset it, which will go back to where our last selection was here. So I'm going to click on this bar here, move it up here, and then just pin it so it's just out of the way here. You can also hide this bar here, which I'm not going to do. The next issue is that it doesn't look very realistic. This doesn't look like it's popping outside of the phone. It just looks like we've done a poor copy and paste job over the phone. So what we need to do is make a selection to confine this picture to the screen area, right? And not these extra bits where it doesn't really give the illusion that it's popping outside the phone. So let's just do that. But our layers here are getting a little bit unruly. So what I'm going to do is group them all together into a folder so then I can keep track of it. With my first layer selected, now I know that it's selected because it's light gray here compared to darker gray here. So if I click on this, click on that, the selected one is the lighter gray. So just make sure that the top layer is selected, and I'm just clicking on the empty area to the side of this. Press Shift on the keyboard and then go down to the child layer here and then press once on my mouse, and all 3 layers are selected now. With these 3 layers selected, right click and go to group from layers. Now that will give us this dialog box. It's going to ask us, well, what is the name of our group? We're going to put child and dog in snow and then press OK. So now we're a little bit organized and we can just turn off the visibility of this layer here. So remember, this eye icon toggles off and on your layers here, right? So what we need to do here is just to tell Photoshop where the selection is that we want to confine the image, and which is basically this area here. Let's make sure that our polygonal lasso tool is still selected. Now remember, if it's not, select it here. If you can't see it, click and hold until these options come out, and just make sure that your second option is selected, polygonal lasso tool. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. There are numerous ways to do it. I'm going to show you using this icon here, and then I'm going to click once here and then go back to my polygonal lasso tool. So it's probably a little bit too big, so I'm just going to go back to my magnifying glass here, and then you can see that the magnifying glass has got a plus, which means it's going to zoom in. If I want to zoom out, I can press Option on my keyboard. I'm using a Mac, so for PC users, that's Alt. Once I've got that, a magnifying glass with a minus icon, just click once to zoom out again. So let's go back to our polygonal lasso tool here. Let's go click once here, click once here. Now, if I click once here, then the middle part here is going to be a little bit cut out, you see. So somehow the refraction of the light probably makes the angle of this not 100% straight. So what I can do is just make a selection here. So click once here, maybe click once here, and then click once here. Now, if you need to zoom in, there is a keyboard shortcut. You can press on a Mac a Command plus to zoom in, or Command minus to zoom out. On a PC, that's Control plus to zoom in and Control minus to zoom out. Now, with this one, I'm just going to press a Command plus just to zoom in a bit. And then this is a bit blurry, so we've got to just make a little bit of a guess as to where the edge is, something like this. And then, oops, and then I'm just going to go to the edge of this and then close my selection here. Now remember, look out for the O next to the polygonal lasso tool. So let's click once here. It's going to turn our selection into marching ants. And I'm going to zoom out a bit. This is a little bit too close. So let's go to View and click on Fit on Screen. What we need to do here is make a mask out of this. So I'm going to click on this layer here just to make sure that it's selected. It's already selected anyway, and I'm going to turn the visibility on this layer here. So now that we've got that there, I'm going to make a mask. And what mask is a cutout. If you can imagine a pair of scissors, we've made the selection, we drew out what we want to cut out. Now we're not physically, now we're metaphorically going to use a scissors to cut out the selection that we've just outlined here. So hit this mask layer icon here. That will constrain the picture into this screen that we've just selected, right? The obvious problem is that we've chopped up the poor kid and dog. So we don't want to do that. But don't worry, there's a quick fix to that. And what we're going to do is just make a duplicate of this folder here. So what I'm going to do is move to the side here, somewhere in the blank area here, right click and go to duplicate group. It's going to ask us, well, do we want to rename it? Let's put dog, or child and dog only, and then press OK, because what we want in this version is just the child and the dog. Now, you can see here that the mask is selected and we don't want the mask here. So I'm going to click and drag this mask and put it in the rubbish bin here. Alternatively, I can just make sure that it's selected. Now, I know that my mask is selected because of this white rim around the mask icon, and press delete. Now what we want to do is cut out the dog and the toddler out from this picture. We don't want any of this background here because that will then give the illusion that it's popping out. So make sure that child and dog only layer is selected. Click on this chevron or this arrow here and make sure that this child layer in this folder is selected here. So the reason why we're selecting this is we're saying any effect that we're going to do is going to use this as our active layer. And the reason why is we're going to select from this layer the dog and the kid here, or the toddler. We're going to use the object selection tool here, and then just make sure that on your options bar, object finder is selected. Now it should find the objects. Now this outline here means that it's found this object here and this object here. Now, if your version doesn't find anything, then just click on this refresh button here, and then it should generate it again. We're going to click once here, and then we're going to hold Shift and then click on this baby here to add to my selection. So holding Shift adds to my current selection. Now what we're going to do is make a mask out of this, but we want the mask to apply to this group here, not just to this here. So let's click on this child and dog group here, this folder here, and this is the mask icon here. So this is how we make a mask. So let's click on that, and like magic, everything else has disappeared and leaving exactly what we want behind. Now I'm going to get rid of this pink overlay here, and the reason why this pink overlay is showing is because the object selection tool is selected. So I'm going to press V on my keyboard to go to my move tool, and that will just get rid of the overlay. So this looks fantastic, doesn't it? So if you followed it up to this point, you're doing really, really well. So well done to you. And if you want extra explanation on what masking is, I do have other tutorials which are in the description or the card up top. Let's see what else we need to do. So we're almost there. This is my sample image which I designed earlier. You can see that there's a little bit more to do. Now, although this is a beginner's guide to Photoshop, I do want to add a little bit of more professionalism here. I'm going to highlight one of the areas that need touching up. I'm going to zoom in here. So Command plus on my keyboard, that's Control plus if you're on a PC. And I'm just going to scroll across here. So you can see that the edge of my selection here is really harsh here, right? So if I go to the background here, the background is blurred a bit. So I'm just going to close this up here. Just press this down arrow here. Just turn this off a little bit. Well, not this one, this one I mean. And you can see that the edge here is quite blurry. So it doesn't really look realistic with this sharp edge here. So what we want to do is inject some realism, even though it's going a little bit beyond the beginner's guide. I'm going to make sure that my mask is selected here. So what we're going to do is going to blur the edges here. So I'm going to go to my blur tool, which is this one here. Now I can increase or decrease the size of my blur brush by clicking on this arrow here and just play around with the size here. Right, and then I can adjust the hardness or how hard the edge of that brush is. So if I go all the way up to 100, it sort of resembles this kind of brush here where the edges are really defined. If I go all the way down to 0, the edges are kind of like this blurry edges. So for this exercise, I'm going to use this hardness of 0, so it will resemble this. And then a size of 42 is okay. Now you can also adjust the size of your brush by clicking on your left bracket key, which is next to the P key on North American keyboards, to make it smaller, and then the right bracket key to make it bigger. Now, if you're using other keyboards which don't have that option, you can always go down to this or go up to this chevron here and then adjust it like this. Make sure that your mask is selected, and all I'm going to do is just click and then just paint it over until it gets blurred here. Now, I should have mentioned that my strength here is at 50% and my mode is normal, my angle is 0. I'm just going to fast forward this until I've blurred all the edges out here. Before I do, you can see that I've hit onto an edge and then I need to scroll down. Now, I can obviously use these handlebars here to scroll up or down, but it's kind of take me a little while to move all the way to the right and then back here. What I can do is press spacebar on my keyboard, and that will bring up the hand icon here. With spacebar still pressed on my keyboard, I'm going to click and drag on my mouse. So I'll see you when I complete this blurring activity. Now there you have it. You can't really see it because I'm zoomed right in. So let's fit it to screen by going to View and then go to Fit on Screen. And that looks a little bit better, right? A lot better, actually, the edges here. Now, if you've done more than you should, you can always press undo by pressing Command Z or Control Z if you're on a PC. Or if not enough, you can always keep on painting it over with the blur tool. The key is to make sure that you're on the mask here on the child and dog in snow layer. Now the next thing to do is to overlay this with snow, because the picture itself has snow, but the background doesn't have snow, so it doesn't really gel together. So what we're going to do is use an overlay for this. So I'm going to go to File, let's go down to a Place Embedded, and the picture that we want starts with Pexels Cotton Bro, and then click once here, or you can double click it. I'm going to click once there and then press Place. What we need to do is fit it to screen here. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit to give me more space. So Command minus or Control minus if you're on a PC to zoom out a little bit. And these are the control handles that I can resize my picture. Now what I want to do is just to rotate it on a landscape orientation and then resize it. So I'm just hovering over this anchor point here. I'm just going to slightly go outside of this here until I see this curved double arrow here. Once I see that, I'm going to click and drag this down so then it goes somewhere like this. Now I want a 90 degree, but it's kind of hard to get it on 90 degrees exactly unless I'm really still with my, or not still, stable with my mouse movements. An easier way is if you press Shift while you're rotating this, then it sort of snaps into 15-degree increments. So at the moment, I'm 30 degrees, 45, and so on. So now I have exactly 90 degrees without having to be very precise on my mouse. So I'm going to just let go, and now I can resize this. Now, depending on your settings, you either need to hold down Shift to constrain this into proportion, or you don't need to. So if you don't need to hold Shift, this is what you will see. Or depending on your preferences or your settings you have on Photoshop, you can let go of Shift. So I'm not holding Shift at the moment, and it's resizing while maintaining this aspect ratio. So I'm going to click on this bottom left and do the same here, just so it covers the entire canvas. I'm going to say that I'm happy with this by pressing this check mark here, or I can press Return on my keyboard. If you're on a PC, that's Enter. Now you can see the obvious issue here is that it's covering everything except this picture of the dog and the kid here. Now the reason why it's not covering the kid is because it's under the child and dog only layer. So this layer here is obscuring all the layers underneath that, and because this layer is underneath this, it's not obscuring this. What we want is actually this layer to be on top of this. So click and drag this all the way to the top until you see this thin blue line here. Don't release your mouse if you see this blue box around here. What you want to do is go even further up until you see this thin blue line, and then let go of your mouse. If you accidentally release your mouse while you saw this blue box here, it means that you've dropped it into that folder here. Now if you've done that, just click on the chevron here. Here it is, so I can click and drag it out of that folder. I'm looking for that thin blue line here to signify that it's outside the group and is on the topmost layer. Now we are having the same problem. It's obscuring everything now. So this is where the next crucial concept comes into play, and that's blend modes. Now, blend modes are more easily demonstrated than explained, but I'm going to give you a short explanation before I demonstrate it. What blend modes are is basically instructions to tell Photoshop how one layer interacts with the other layers below that. So that doesn't really make any sense, does it? So let me just show you. So here at the moment is a normal blend mode. If I click on this drop down, I see all the other blend modes. So if I just scroll down, you can see some effect on the document view here. Depending on what you click on, or what you hover over, I should say, that determines how each of the layers interact with the overlay layer. So what we want is to click on screen here, and that will make all the black disappear but only keep the lighter part of that image here. So I'm just going to make this a bit bigger by going to view and then going on to fit on screen, just so you can see it a little bit better. So that's what the screen mode does. So you can just scroll along to see the effect that it has. And remember, just to cement the knowledge into mine again, blend modes are instructions to tell Photoshop how one layer, which is this layer, interacts with the other layers here. The other thing that you can do with blend modes is you can adjust the opacity. So if you think that this is too much or too heavy, I can reduce my opacity by just scrubbing to the left, click and drag to the left, and just fade it out a little bit. Or if I'm happy with it, I can fade it all the way back to 100%. Maybe fade to 100% isn't necessarily the right word, but turn it up all the way to 100%. Right, so this is looking really, really nice. So well done to you if you're following along as well. So the next thing that we're going to do is add some text. So if I go to my sample picture here, I've got I'm walking. So let's go back to our image here. To type that in, I'm going to go to my text tool here, T for my text tool here. I'm going to click once here onto my canvas, and now I've got my contextual text bar here. Now because I pinned it, it's kind of far away from what I'm doing, so I'm just going to reset this here by clicking on these three dots here, and then it'll go underneath the area that I'm working on. So I'm going to just type I'm walking exclamation. I'm going to change the font, so let's click and highlight everything, and the font could be anything really. So I think what I've used was BBass, I think it is, and then I'm going to change the color from black to white. So click and drag. The reason why I'm clicking and dragging, just to make sure that I've got the absolute white here, and I'm going to press OK. I'm also going to make it a whole lot bigger, so click on this and then go 150 maybe. And if that's too small, remember I can go onto this T icon here, and this icon with the scrubby left and right arrows will show, and I'm going to click and drag it to the right to increase it. I'm going to confirm my change by clicking on this check mark here. The issue is that I want the text behind this baby's head. This is the effect that I'm looking for. So remember, with layers, the top layer will take precedence. I want this text layer to be behind. So this text layer has to be below this layer here. Now this layer is the child and dog only layer. So I'm going to test that out by clicking on this visibility icon here. And have I got the right layer? Yes, I do, because that's turning off and on. So what I want to do is click and drag this text layer so that this text layer is underneath this child and dog only folder. Now remember, don't put it into the folder, and this is this blue box here. That means that if I drop it right now, it will go into that folder. I don't want to do that. I want to scroll down ever so slightly so I get this blue bar here, and then once I do, it's going to go underneath this folder here. So now I have it behind this child here. Isn't that great? I want to move this a little. Now I've got my text tool selected here. To move anything, there is a tool called Move. Well done if you were shouting out at your screen. So I can either go to the Move tool here or press V on the keyboard, and then with my text layer selected here, I'm just going to move it something like this. Now the next thing I'm going to do is just to add some effects to it. Let's go to our FX icon here, click once and go to blending options. I'm just going to move it out the way by clicking and dragging on this header here. And what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to go through all these effects here. You can play around with it in your own time, but I'm going to show you 3 of them. One of them is bevel emboss. So click on the word bevel and emboss here. Now the reason why you click on the word, don't click on the check mark here. The difference is that if you only click on the check mark, you will only turn on your existing settings here and you won't see the options here. So let me just demonstrate that. So if I turn that off and then turn it back on, you see that I don't have my bevel and emboss options here just by clicking on my option here. To see my options, I have to click on the word here, okay? And then I can see it. The technique here, the style, you can play around with it. At the moment, I've got outer, which is basically the bevel emboss is going to be on the outer side of the text. I've got inner emboss. I'm not going to go through all of it. So let's click on inner. Technique is chisel hard, which basically means that the edge of this is really hard. So this is smooth, this is hard. And then the depth, you can crank it all the way up, and that just determines how big the bevel is. And then the size again is just exaggeration of that as well. Now you can play around with all this, or you can copy this. The next one I'm going to choose is I'm going to put a stroke around it. Now again, press the word stroke, not the check mark. The color that I want is, I'm going to click once here, and I'm going to, just to make it stand out, I'm probably going to just go down to here, click and drag this hue slider here, and then go up to here. So this is kind of the yellow that I want, just to make it stand out. It's not standing out at all because it's very thin, but this is the bright yellow that I want. If you want to copy these settings, you can, or you can copy this hex code here. So once that I'm happy with this color, I'm going to press OK. And now I'm going to adjust the size of my bevel, well not bevel, my stroke here. So the position is whether I want the stroke on the outside of my letters, the inside, or a bit of both, which is the center here. I'm going to click on center, and then I'm just going to add a drop shadow. Now again, I've clicked on the word drop shadow, not the check mark here. I've got black as my color here, so click and drag here, and then the blend mode is multiply. I think that's default, and I can increase my opacity. Now it doesn't do anything because at the moment my distance, the distance of my shadow is too close to my word. So if I adjust that and then adjust my opacity, then you can see that my shadow is a little bit more transparent. I can play with the size, which basically is the feather of that, and then I can adjust the spread as well. I'm probably not going to win any awards for this, but it's not the point of this tutorial. I've just wanted to show you some of the options here. I'm going to press OK, and now that is fine. You might be wondering, when I was doing all those options, I was probably happy with that, but now maybe that I want to change the color of the stroke. Can I do that? Yes, you can. Yes, you can. We can go back to our layers here. So go back to our layers, our text layer here, and then you can see all these effects here. So if I wanted to change, for example, my stroke, I can double click on the word stroke and my layer style menu will come up. So again, I can click on my color and then go to whatever color that I want. Say I want this kind of bright cyan, and then press OK. While I'm here, I can also select bevel and emboss, drop shadow if I want to edit anything else. For the sake of this video, I'm not going to. I'm going to press OK just to make sure that the changes to my stroke is registered, and there you have it. So the next tool that I'm going to show you is the remove tool. Not that it's going to mean a lot to many of you out there if you're a complete beginner, but the remove tool is kind of like in the league of generative fill, where it removes blemishes or scratches or anything that you want removed, and it does a pretty decent job. So I'm going to go back to my layers here, and I'm going to just make myself a little bit more room here. I'm going to collapse all these effects into a layer here. So let's click on this up arrow here, and that will collapse it. So I'm going to click on my iPhone layer here, and I'm going to create a new layer on top of this. Now this layer will be a blank layer. So let's go to this plus icon here. This is the new layer icon here. And let's just rename this by double clicking on this and just say remove. and press return on our keyboard. So we're going to go to our remove tool here. Depending on your settings, you might have a different icon showing. So let's click and hold until these icons come up, and there you have the remove tool here. So let's click on the second option, and now this brush, tiny little brush, comes up. We can resize this by pressing the right bracket key to make it bigger and then the left bracket key to make it smaller. Alternatively, you can also make this adjustment on this slider here. So the other options here, now I've just clicked outside of that, is sample all layers. We want that. And then we're going to just leave remove after each stroke. I'm going to just explain what these mean. So what sample all layers is that when you remove, it actually removes and generates something else on top of it. That's why we want sample all layers, because it's going to look through all the layers and then remove based on the layers that it sees. So let's get started. So this brush is a little bit too big because I want to remove these holes here on the iPhone. So I'm going to press my left bracket key, something like this, just big enough so it covers it. And then I'm going to click and drag all the way there and then release my mouse. And like magic, it removes these holes here. Now let's just do it again and removes. Isn't that wonderful? Now the remove after each stroke, because I've got it turned on, as soon as I release my mouse, it removes the item that I've got selected. If I undo that and then do that again, so now I have to manually tell it to say, okay, well, I'm happy with my selection here. Now remove it. So then the next question is, well, why do I want to do that then? Because it doesn't remove after each stroke, do the hard work for you. So I don't need to, always go to this checkbox. Yes and no, it really depends on what you're trying to do. So if I have to select multiple things, I might not necessarily want it to remove after each stroke. So let's say I want to remove this, and I want to remove this, and I want to remove this. So I've made multiple selections. Now that I've made all the selections that I wanted, then I can press this button here, and that will remove it altogether. You can see how powerful this is. So if you got any touch-up portraits, blemishes on your face, pimples, etc., you can see how very quickly you can remove those scars, those blemishes, scratches, whatever. So that's a really powerful tool. It's a new addition to Photoshop. I think it's been out for probably 6 months or so. Now the next thing that I want to show you is the gradient tool. So that's just to jazz it up a bit. So if I go to my sample layer here, no, not layer, I don't know why I keep saying layer, sample picture here, it's got a different color here. I'm going to go back here. I'm going to invoke my gradient tool here, which is this one next to the blur tool or the eraser tool. I'm going to click on that, and then these options appear in the options bar. I'm going to click on here, and then these wonderful options come about. So it's a bit small to see. So what you can do, you see these little inconspicuous lines here, but that does a really powerful thing. If I click and drag that, it can resize my window for me. So that will make it easier for me to see. Now, these are the gradients that are available to me. You can go through it. I'm not going to go through it for the sake of time, but you can see that I have a lot of options. And maybe I'm going to choose this color here. I'm going to click out of that, and I've got a linear gradient selected here. I'll go through the different options later, but for the time being, let's click on linear gradient. Don't reverse it. The other is selected. It doesn't really make a difference, and then method is perceptual. So roughly around about halfway through the picture here, I'm going to click and drag it out all the way so it ends up to the other side. Now we can see that we have the same problem as before. It's obscuring all the layers underneath it. So we're going to fix that a little bit later. For the time being, we'll go through the different options that the gradient has. So this is the linear gradient, and now this is the radial gradient. You can't really see the difference. I'm going to zoom out a bit by pressing Command minus. If you're on a PC, what is it? It's Control minus. Very good. So Control minus, 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 minus until we go all the way there. So to resize this gradient, I can click on the endpoint here and then just resize it here. There's also some transitions here that I can scrub here if I don't want the blue, or if I don't want this pinkish bit here, I can resize it, and similarly, etc. Right? So let's just move that back here. I can also change the shape of it, kind of like a little bit more obscured and a little bit more circular here. If I want to move it, I can click on the center bit and then move this point here and then just close this down here. So that's the radial tool, radial gradient, and this is the angle one, reflected, and the diamond shape. So if I just make it smaller, it's a lot easier to see the effect. Now you can play around with it in your own time. For the sake of this video, I'm going to click on the radial gradient. Just click this out again so it's stretched out to the outside the boundaries of that. So let's zoom back in. So I'm going to press Command 0 to zoom back in. That's exactly the same as if I were to go to View and then Fit on Screen. You can see the shortcut here. That's Command 0. Because I'm on a Mac, it says Command 0. If you're on a PC, it would say Control 0. So I'm going to click outside of that. And what I want this gradient to have an effect on is all the layers. So I'm going to click and drag it all the way up here. Make sure that I've got this little slim line here. And then now we've got the issue that it's obscuring all the layers underneath that, right? But we have come across this issue before. And how do we get around that? Well, we can use blend modes. We can click on this option here and then just cycle through the blend modes until we're happy with what we see here. So let's just go through it here very quickly. Maybe we want overlay. Now overlay, if I select that, is a little bit too strong. So remember, we have our opacity option here. Just gonna slide it a little bit to the left, maybe 50% will do. Something like this will be okay. Just say that you've been working on something else, you've clicked on this and you want to edit your gradient again. All you have to do is go back to the gradient icon here, not the mask here, the icon here, and then your gradient bar will still show up. So you can click on here and then select, a different gradient or whatever you like. But, oh, maybe that looks good, but I'm going to change it back to what I had it, or maybe I'll select this one. Once I'm happy with that, just click outside that. So the second last thing that I'm going to show you is the adjustment layers. The adjustment layers is what the name suggests. It adjusts your layers, right? So this is your adjustment layer icon here. Now there are a lot here, and there are some that overflows on my screen, which you can't see. So there are more options after this, but I'm not going to go through all of it. I'm going to show you some of these one here. So the brightness and contrast adjustment layer is what the name suggests. So before I adjust some of these, the effect that adjustment layer will have is on all the layers underneath it. And because this is the top layer, it's going to affect all the layers underneath that. If you don't want it to adjust the gradient layer, for example, you put it underneath that, so therefore it would only affect everything below that. So I'm just going to undo that because I want the whole adjustment to apply to everything below that. I'm going to press Command and Control Z to bring it back to where it was. So with the brightness lever, I can dim it down, brighten that up. I can increase the contrast. You can see that. Now, I didn't really want that effect, so I'm going to click and drag it to the trash can, and I'm going to use another very powerful curves, and I'm just going to give you a really short overview of this. I'm just going to make myself some room here, click and scroll down here. Curves is a very powerful tool. You can play around with this. You can makes the darks darker. So this area here is where the darks are, as in where your dark tones, your blacks, your shadows are. And this here, where it's highlighted in white, is where all your bright parts are. So if I move it up here, it'll become lighter. If I move it down, it'll move it darker. So the darks will become darker here, and the lights will become lighter here. I do have a whole tutorial on curves, so I'm not going to go through it here. The links are in the description if you're curious about how curves work. And again, I can reduce down the effect if I wanted to. Now, as I said, there are a whole bunch of adjustments layers here, which I'm not going to go through. If you want me to go through it one by one, leave me a comment and I'm more than happy to go through it. But it's really beyond the scope of a beginner's guide to Photoshop. The last thing that I'm going to show you is, now that you've created this masterpiece, how are you going to save it? Let's save this by going to File, and you can either save it and then make sure that you've save it as a Photoshop file. A Photoshop file will maintain all these layers here, all these effects here. You don't want to save it as a JPEG only, because that's a flat file. You can't edit it. There's no layers and you can't go back to any of these settings here. Let's make sure that Photoshop is selected, and let's just choose a name for it. So child and dog pop out. And then I'm going to press save. And it's going to ask me whether I want to maximize compatibility. I'm going to press OK. So if I open up again, so let's go to File, Open, and now I've got this child and doc pop up here, Photoshop document PSD here. I'm going to open that, but it's already open, so I'm just going to return it back to here. But if you want to send this to somebody, they may not have Photoshop. So what you might want to do is save it as a JPEG. So you can go to File, and let's go to Export, and let's go to Export As. Now this export dialog box will come up, and the format is JPEG. Now there are different options, PNG and GIF. I won't go through the differences here, but for the time being, we can click on JPEG, and here we can adjust the quality of it. I'm happy with the default, and then I'm just going to leave everything as it is, and then I'm just going to press export. It's going to ask me where I want to save it. I'm going to save it in the exact area that all my other stuff is saved. So child and doc pop-up JPEG, I'm going to press save. And now if I open this, so let's go to File, Open, and let's go to this JPEG here. Let's press open. You can see in my layers panel here that all the layers that I have are disappeared. We can't edit any of those things. This is the image that we see. This is the final version. So there you have it, a beginner's guide to Photoshop. If you've got any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments area. And if you like this video, make sure that you like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you can see the next video whenever I post. Have a great day, everyone, and happy Photoshopping.